So really what we're talking about, even though it's not necessarily put forward this way, is silence, or at least a silent thinking mind. So although the talks take the form of an hour and a half of talking and pointing at things that happen in life through concepts, which can sometimes make it seem like our job is to think a lot, which might then seem like, oh, this liberation or this freedom is from me understanding a lot and thinking a lot. That can be a bit of a misunderstanding, because really all of the words are there in order to assist with a quietening down, a silencing of the thinking mind. And so what is described is the different forms that the thinking mind takes, so that those forms of thinking can be identified and seen to be less useful and less effective than we might have thought they were. And that seeing of them in that light is a very important part of their slowing down. If we don't see a certain type of thinking as problematic or counter to something that is optimal, and in fact think that it is part of getting us to an optimal place, then it persists, it carries on. And to be frank, our thinking mind is so habitual and obsessive because the brain has developed in that way because it thinks that it has somewhere particular to get, and that this thinking is going to be helpful in achieving a certain objective. And so if the objective isn't delivered today, then the thinking says, well, let me think a little bit more in this way that I've decided is useful in order for me to maybe find the objective delivered tomorrow. The thinking says, if the objective is delivered tomorrow, it will be because I have thought hard and well enough and managed to shape life or function a particular way. So that thinking gets set in place, and it's seen as being helpful thinking, when in fact it's not. And so it persists. So part of the process by which the unhelpful thinking, which is assumed to be helpful thinking, falls away is by us seeing it for what it really is. An obstacle to that which we are really seeking, which is really peace of mind. And peace of mind turns out to be the absence of the thinking mind. So, very clearly, if this thinking, the thinking of the thinking mind, remains in place because we think it is beneficial, then the peace of mind which we're really looking for, which is just the absence of the thinking mind, is not going to happen. An in-between stage of the process, which is a very important stage, and if we find that this starts happening, we can be very grateful because it indicates something very important. An in-between stage is where the thinking of the thinking mind continues to arise because its root is still there. The belief that it is useful on some level is still in the body or in the brain, in the system, let's say. So it's still happening, and another part of the system understands that actually this thinking is not helpful, but it's still arising because the root is still in place, and the other part of the system understands that that root isn't going to be uprooted in this moment by someone making a whole lot of effort, because that effort tends to be actually reinforcing that root. And so if that's how our system has started to be reconditioned, such that it will witness and allow the suffering to arise, the thinking mind to arise, understanding it's coming from a deeply ingrained root that is still in place, and so therefore the suffering has to continue to arise. And it then accepts it as part of the landscape, understands it. It's very important that we have an understanding of why it's arising. It's arising not because we are creating it, we as a doer that can stop creating it, but rather it's arising because the genes and up-to-date conditioning of the body-mind organism, which is a very complex organism, the genes and up-to-date conditioning include the belief from which the thinking mind grows. So if we understand that if that belief is in place, the suffering just has to be there. Right? It's just simple impersonal cause and effect. Right, so let's look at an example. If fire is there, heat has to be there. It's a interconnected aspect of the fire. So if we understand that the heat is there because the fire is there, then we don't try to insist that the heat not be there, because we understand that fire and heat come with each other. So if we can understand that if there is a certain belief in the system that's been put in place by life and reinforced day after day after day after day for many years, that's what it means by a deeply ingrained belief. If we can understand our life has put that in place, and so the thinking that makes sense from that belief system, it's an inevitability. That means that now there's an understanding of why the thinking is there. It's not a surprise. It's not, unexplainable. We no longer go around saying, why is this thinking happening? It's very simple, because there is a root for it. And the root is a belief that you didn't put in place. So on the one hand, you can say it's my belief because it is part of this body-mind organism. But what's more important is to see, how did it become part of this body-mind organism? And like all beliefs, like all conditioning of this body-mind organism, it happened, it got put in place as part of life unfolding. So on the one hand, we can say it's my belief, but we need to be very careful with the use of the word my belief. It's a belief that resides in this body-mind organism. And because we're not the ones that put it in place, we're not the ones that remove it. So there's a huge amount of relaxation that can happen if this simple dynamic is deeply understood, not just believed. Right? It's easy to hear it and believe it. Hopefully, the rationale that explains why we didn't put it there or why we can't get rid of it, and explains that the suffering does stem from a cause. If that's understood deeply, then that understanding creates a space, an acceptance. So another explanation that can run in parallel to this as another example of how when we understand something, our resistance to it and our questioning of it can fall away. So, and the other example is that often we look at life and say, why are there handicapped children? What did they do? Why are there people below the poverty line? Why is it that some people get ill at a young age? And the very simple explanation for this, it's very simple, so it won't be acceptable to some people. The simple explanation is that this life that we're aware of, this life that we live in, is a life of duality on the surface. It's a life of interconnected opposites. That this particular creation is one of good and bad, health and disease, wealth and poverty. You can't have one without the other within this particular manifestation. Now, there could be any number of other different manifestations, either past or in the future or parallel to this one. And in those other manifestations, it might be a manifestation of not duality, a manifestation that exists on completely different terms to this manifestation. It may be a manifestation that has nothing to do with time and space, nothing to do with cause and effect. And so in that manifestation, everything would be according to the framework of that particular manifestation. This manifestation is a manifestation of duality, which means interconnected opposites. If there is kindness, there will be evil. Now, this explanation isn't going to turn pain into pleasure. It's not an explanation that will magically resolve everything so that it is no longer duality. It's simply an explanation that says when duality presents itself, meaning when pleasure turns into pain, or when we see pain delivered and know it to be pain relative to some other alternative, we can understand, this is part of life. This is not life malfunctioning, but this is life presenting as duality. So then the question why is this happening, can fall away if that answer is satisfying to us. And why is that important? It's important because we have developed in a way that includes a belief system, which is part of the suffering that arises from time to time, a belief system that says, what I am is something that requires life to be a particular way in order for me to be complete. Which means there is an expectation ingrained in us, which is also part of the structure, the root that I was talking about, from which suffering arises. An expectation gets put in place when we have this idea of ourselves, that what I am is something that requires life to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. So automatically an expectation gets put in place. I need life to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. I expect it to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. And that expectation can be so powerful that it prevents us from actually seeing life objectively and being honest, seeing things as they are clearly. If the expectation is strong enough, we simply can't see life that way. It would be too painful. So we continue with an idea of the new age of enlightenment coming in, where one day life will be brilliantly perfect, where everyone will love each other. And that's just another expectation for life to be pleasure, 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 where we receive love from the other. And why is this perpetuated? It's perpetuated because we have a deep attachment to pleasure, and the deepest attachment to pleasure is the attachment to love. And the attachment to love is there because the belief system that's in place, which emanates not only as thoughts but as feelings of unworthiness and insecurity, lack of self-worth. That belief system says that in order for me to be complete, I require love from society, I require love from the other. So maybe we can see this, the seeing of it happens just when life delivers the right prompts and makes us realize, wow, what I'm doing, which sounds altruistic, waiting for life to become perfect and trying to spread the world of a new age of enlightenment or something that will has already started. You know, we're now in that age, let's say, of that happening. Maybe what's happening is we're just perpetuating and reinforcing our expectation for life to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. Instead of seeing it for what it is, the manifestation right now is a manifestation of good and bad, of interconnected opposites. Health and disease, wealth and poverty, male and female. And the great news is that when our expectations start weakening and we start seeing life as it really is, a flow of pleasure and pain that isn't really in our control. We wake up in the morning, we step out of the door, and we step into life. We don't really need to step out of the door. You just need to wake up and you're in life. But what's waiting for you is not in our control. How the day unfolds is not in our control. It happens. We might like to think it's in our control. And if we think it's in our control, we might experience it in our control. When we look closely, we see that life happens, and it's not our doing. And so if we can start to see that life is always an unfolding flow of pleasure and pain, and that it will always be that, and if we start hearing that actually that's not a problem. If someone glares at you, that's pain in the moment. If someone shouts at you, that's pain in the moment. If someone steals from you, that's pain in the moment. If someone disrespects you, that's pain in the moment. And for as long as that deeply ingrained belief that says my completeness will be there when no one disrespects me, when no one steals from me, when no one looks at me in a judgmental way. For as long as that expectation is in place, we are bound to feel resistance to the pains that are delivered moment after moment. But if we start hearing that what we're really looking for in life is not for life to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. And when I say what we're really looking for, means once all the lack of clarity has fallen away, we'll find that what we've really been looking for, even if we haven't been actively looking for it, because we thought we were looking for something else, when all the lack of clarity falls away, we'll realize what we're really looking for is happiness in the form of peace of mind. And that peace of mind is very much available even when someone steals from us, even when someone disrespects us or is not honest to us. The happiness of peace of mind is a happiness that is there when someone steals from you and the thinking mind doesn't fire up and extend horizontally in time, holding hatred towards the person that has stolen from you, holding an expectation of how that situation should have turned out, holding possibly shame or guilt towards one's actions that were part of the circumstance that led to your property being stolen. That's the happiness. Happiness in the face of unfortunate circumstance. So, as I mentioned, really the talks are about silence, about the silencing of the thinking mind. So, on what basis does the thinking mind become more and more silent? It becomes more and more silent on the basis of the core beliefs being seen to be inaccurate. The core beliefs that support the horizontal thinking that we can call our attitude to circumstance. It happens when the core beliefs get seen to be inaccurate. And what sees those beliefs as inaccurate is the other part of the brain or the body-mind organism, the part that we can call the working mind. And so this talk is simply life delivering new conditioning to the working mind. That's how change has always happened. Life has always brought about new conditioning, and we evolve. So a baby that is unable to speak evolves to a point where it can speak, because life has delivered new conditioning moment after moment after moment, in the form of, when we're talking about a baby learning how to speak, in the form of hearing other people speak, in the form of a parent providing lessons about words and language. So all of that is new conditioning that brings about change in the body-mind organism. And then that change allows the body-mind organism to function according to its current makeup. A functioning that wasn't able to happen when the makeup was different. And so these talks are new conditioning that can become part of the working mind, which is part of the body-mind organism. And the working mind can start seeing the existing beliefs in the body-mind organism, seeing the existing beliefs that we conceptually call the thinking mind. And to make it simple, all of the suffering, which is what disturbs our peace of mind, is based on essentially two beliefs, two deeply, deeply ingrained beliefs that life has put in place. And as I said, life put them in place because, or they got put in place because they seem to be accurate. And the two beliefs are, one, I am the doer of everything that happens through me in life, and the other is the doer of everything that happens through them in life. So that belief, I am the doer, is really a way of seeing everything that happens through this body-mind organism and through the other body-mind organism. And it's an inaccurate way of seeing it, but essentially what I'm pointing out here is that the belief in personal doership is an attitude, a way of seeing and interpreting what happens. So it interprets a thought that arises as my thought, my doing. I created it. It interprets the words that are coming out of our mouth as my words, my doing. I'm in control of those words. It interprets the actions of the body as my actions, a result of my autonomy and control. And so then it sees the thoughts and the emotions and the words and the actions of the other in the same light. So this is the attitude of personal doership. It's a belief system, a belief that says, I believe deep, deep, deep down inside that I am the orchestrator, the doer of everything that happens through me. And therefore I believe that the other is the orchestrator of everything that happens through them. And what I mean by orchestrator, I mean some independent, autonomous entity that is insulated from life, and therefore, being insulated, is some sort of controlling entity. And this belief system essentially creates the idea that there is a middleman inside of us, like what me is, that is at the steering wheel, deciding how to function in each moment. So if we're really honest with ourselves, if we really look at how we see ourselves, how we see the functioning that happens through the body-mind organism, we'd say, like, if we drop all sorts of concepts that spirituality has given us, including these talks, and we say, like, honestly, how do I see myself? How do I see the words that are coming out of my mouth and the actions of the body? And when the belief in personal doership is in place, when we answer this question honestly, we'll say, well, yeah, I do believe that I am a separate, independent entity that has complete volition, complete control over what I do next and what I say next. So if we can look and ask ourselves this question, how do I really see myself and how do I relate to everything that happens through me? If we can say, yes, I do feel like I am a separate, independent entity, that there's a degree of honesty there. And honesty means clarity. Now, hopefully a lot of people that are here and listening to the recordings and the live videos actually can answer that question and honestly say, well, no, I don't see myself like that anymore. At least maybe not completely like that. But let's work on the basis that when we ask this question, how do I see myself and how do I see all of the outputs of this body? Let's work on the basis that honestly, if we answer the question honestly, we say, yes, I do feel like I am a separate, independent doer, meaning an entity in control of everything that I have ever said and feel and do and think. Because that's what I'm pointing out as the belief that is not in line with how things really are. So the next part is an explanation for the working mind, an explanation as to why we're not a separate, independent entity with complete volition, complete control over what happens next. And this is essentially the most important part of the teaching. The explanation is that what we are is a very complex biological organism. A human being is a body-mind organism that is conscious. And how did we come to be this? It's fascinating how the belief is in place, because the explanation is really quite simple. How did we come to be like we are in each moment? How did we come to be the way we were when we were a 5-year-old? And when we were a 10-year-old and a 20-year-old and so on? The explanation is that the sperm and the egg came together and formed an organism that has in it a biological intelligence that starts functioning at that very early stage. And the functioning of the biological intelligence is to get the organism to grow a certain way, following a certain blueprint. And now it should be really simple for us to see that the resulting entity that is here, and the resulting entity that was there at the time, wasn't some autonomous controller of the growing process, but rather the growing process happened impersonally as a result of impersonal life. And at some point, the organism had grown to such a point that there was a heart that started beating, and then the brain developed such that certain cognitive function starts, and the arms and the legs developed, and all the muscles and nerves and everything developed. So the human being is an amazingly complex and beautiful body-mind organism that has spawned out of life and grown out of life. And from the moment that the organism came into existence, not only did it have an internal blueprint that developed, that expanded according to the DNA structure, you could say. That's the internal blueprint. Not only was that there, but it started being conditioned by the external environment. And the external environment became part of the growing process. And so the child being exposed to language, being exposed to the face, the visual of the parents, and at some point seeing the mother walk in the door and for the first time saying, "Mama," wasn't its doing as something, some entity that was in control, but rather it was an outcome that was forced out of it based on its development at that particular point in time. An action or a speech couldn't have happened a moment before. It couldn't have happened a week before. The child wasn't developed such that happened. And then on the day that it happened, because of the circumstance that the child found itself in. Circumstance being a room, let's say, and then the mother entering the room and the child becoming aware of the mother. And as a result of seeing something, the brain functioned a particular way and the words came out, mama. And then the mother gets all excited and the baby smiles because the mother's got all excited and said, well done, or you've said mummy for the first time. That's also part of the circumstance that the baby now finds itself in, new circumstance, and based on its gene. So everything in life that happens through us is a happening, an automatic happening according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance we find ourselves in, especially and including the thoughts that arise in each moment. The thoughts are like cookies being spat out of a cookie machine. And the cookie machine in this case is the brain or the body-mind organism being exposed to a certain environment, and automatically thoughts get thrown out. And then there is an awareness of those thoughts happening. And the thinking mind suddenly jumps in and claims ownership over it as my thought. Oh, I shouldn't have that thought. Or I should have more of those thoughts. I'm very good for having that thought and I'm very bad for having that thought. Instead of saying, that thought happened, the thought was witnessed as a happening, arising as a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I can thank or blame God for. No, there is no God to thank or blame. It's just a result of life. So, not my doing, but an inevitability, a happening. This, once again, isn't an excuse for good or bad actions happening. This is the reason why good or bad actions happen. And to call them good or bad actions, we have to set up a certain benchmark. So it is a good action or a bad action relative to a certain benchmark. And setting up benchmarks is important for certain practical tasks in life. But when it comes to seeing life clearly on a bigger picture basis, it's important to understand that these benchmarks are all relative benchmarks that we set in place. And from a more fundamental point of view, everyone just is. And they are part of the overall manifestation of life, which also is. And so the idea of life being good or bad from a certain perspective doesn't make sense. It is what it is. We are what we are. And so holding that perspective for a while, where we don't label anything as good or bad because we just see it as part of the manifestation and therefore very valid. Because we understand this manifestation is not a manifestation of pleasure, 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 but a manifestation of duality. Meaning, a more simple way is the manifestation is a manifestation of whatever it is. So we don't even need to label it as a manifestation of duality. It is God turned into this. So from that perspective, we might find that we stop labeling and judging everything as good or bad, which has the capacity to bring us into the present moment. Because that judging of things as good and bad is usually a judging relative to my expectations, which is part of the thinking mind. And so as the thinking mind is interfered with, by some new conditioning that describes life differently to the working mind. And so then the working mind says, hey, this makes sense. Let me just allow life to just be. Let me see life as a happening without continually running a commentary on whether it should or shouldn't be that way. And if we do this, we automatically find that our view of life widens, where we're not really interested in seeing what we want to see, but we're interested in seeing the whole of what's happening. And when the thinking mind quietens down like that, and we're interested in just watching life happen for the sake of life for the sake of life, then we find there's more presence and more peace, more connection to what we are at the core of our being. We start to realize, the thinking mind is this sort of layer, this obstacle that when it's functioning, when that thinking is seen to be valid, disconnects me from the core of my being. A core that is complete in this moment, complete in every moment, even in the moments when the thinking mind was doing its thing and creating a sense that things were missing. We were still complete at the core, but that completeness was covered up. And so whenever the thinking mind gets interrupted and we start experiencing life free of the thinking mind, we come in contact with the core of who we are. And a little smile can come onto your face each time that we reconnect and we remember that, here I am. Here's what a relief. I'm back in contact with the part of me that doesn't require anything to be a particular way. Part of me that is at peace, that is content in a very simple and ordinary way. So even the expectation for peace can be a problem. If we're saying, well, I hear about this peace of mind, now if it turns into an expectation, there's going to be a commentary and a thinking about this peace of mind as if it's something that I don't have, that I would like to have, and how do I get it? And then the thinking mind is continually thinking about what it doesn't have and how it needs to get it, and actually it just needs to stop. And then we find, here's the peace. So the continual seeking with a certain attitude is actually one of the obstacles to that which we are looking for. But that stopping, just stop and be, that only happens once life has delivered enough new conditioning that generates a stop of the thinking mind. So it's a sort of a bit of a catch-22. We need to seek in order to be exposed to the information that eventually leads to a stopping of the seeking. And there's also a very interesting phase where the seeking carries on, but where there is no attachment to outcome, where there is no seeker trying to do seeking, where that seeking has been surrendered and there's just a curiosity about seeing life as it is. And so the working mind can continue to function, pointing out, look, there's pleasure and pain, but just with a earnestness, with a curiosity, with an interest in seeing things as they are, without having a strong expectation that seeing things as they are will deliver something in particular. Knowing that actually just the interest and the earnestness to see things as they are without an expectation delivers effortlessly that which we are actually looking for. That's a very specific point in the seeking, where the seeking continues to happen, where suffering still arises from time to time, and now the body-mind organism has been changed sufficiently that the strong seeker looking for an outcome has dissolved. So I've spoken long enough, given it's about silence. Have you got any questions? Or comments? They don't have to be questions.
Feel, maybe I've asked this before sometime, very tired, even though it's just 2 hours of talk, but I don't know what's going on, that there's just not able to do so much after the talks, and sleep long hours, and need for protection in terms of clothing or sunglasses when I step out. Is it connected to what's going on? Because when the talks are not happening, I don't experience this kind of fatigue.
I have a theory on that, having experienced this sort of fatigue myself when I was engaging in certain teachings. And that is that what is being said, one, comes from a deep grounding in a seeing of life that way. And when that's the case, and the beliefs to the contrary have fallen away, essentially the experience of life changes such that there is a lot less denseness in the experience, because the beliefs tend to be very dense forms of consciousness, you could say. And so if those beliefs exit the body, what we find is that there's a lot of spaciousness. And you could say that spaciousness has a resonance to it, or a frequency to it. So our experience changes frequency in a way. It becomes less dense and more light. And so when the speaking is happening, it's speaking coming from that place. So the words have a certain frequency to them. And not only do the words themselves have a certain frequency, but the concepts are concepts that are describing that intuitively we know to be accurate. And so when the words, and especially if they're put in simple language, when the words come into the system, there can be a bit of a battle that goes on in the system between the understanding that is contained in the words and what's in our system, which often includes some of that understanding and some of the misunderstanding, some of the opposite ideas. So when you read certain spiritual texts, some of the things that are said can have a very piercing effect. So I'm saying it because I used to experience it when I would read certain texts. And maybe just a paragraph needs to be read, and then I'd find myself having to lie down and sleep for 2 hours. And so my theory is that this information is very charged and very to the point, and when it's received in the system, a fight essentially starts. Like, in a way you could say that this information is like the antidote to the misinformation in our system. And this fight sort of requires a lot of body energy. It's almost like our immune system, our wisdom immune system, is being charged by the exposure, and then the wisdom immune system goes into action and requires energy. So it shuts down certain faculties of the body by making us tired. Just like when we're sick, the body requires energy, so it shuts down certain movements of the body. And when that resting happens, I used to feel, I don't know, I was very connected to my body, and I used to feel this happening inside. And I was very convinced that this is the process happening in a way where I don't need to worry, I just need to surrender and know that the process is happening. It takes a bit of courage also to surrender to this rest, because people around us won't understand this process. They'll be encouraging us to, get on with life, you're wasting your life away. And so at some point we actually have maybe doubts of our own, and so the pressure from other people can become too much, and we resist this fatigue, which is doing the opposite of what the body's trying to get us to do, which is to surrender and let the process happen. Surrender to the process. And so my suggestion and my input on this is that this process is probably the most legitimate and valuable project that anyone can commit to in life. And so if we really feel that this is a process that is happening for us, that the change is happening, it might be slow, but we see that change is happening, then we just need to keep reminding ourselves that regardless of what other people think, which often is based on their own misunderstanding of life, right? Where they're not particularly happy or successful in a meaningful way. They might be outwardly successful, but when you really look and say, do they have what I'm really looking for, which is this peace of mind? We can often find that the people giving us advice aren't really great role models when it comes to what we're really looking for. So that doesn't mean necessarily being rude to them or anything, but it means understanding their functioning the way that they're designed to function, but what they're saying is not necessarily coming from a place of wisdom. So if we can appreciate that this project that life has gifted us is actually the most valuable way that we can spend our time. Nothing is a more useful or valid way of spending time than a project that reveals what we truly are and delivers what we're truly looking for in life. So hopefully that can bring about an overcoming of the doubts that we sometimes have.
Actually, what you say, based upon that, certain process starts, kind of investigation. But what I have observed in myself is that it is mainly intellectual. It tries to seep down, try to touch the feelings, but somehow I feel fear. And I somehow want to, connect with the feelings and the body, but there is some kind of resistance which is appearing. So just wanted to share with you.
A resistance when you come into the body?
To the body and to the emotions like heart. Then there is kind of fear, resistance. I don't want to go in that direction. Mm-hmm. Such kind of feelings come up. And when it's just the escape, then I keep on looking for certain activities and distract myself.
Mm-hmm. So what you describe is an uncomfortableness,
yes.
Or you can use the word fear. Fear might be more correct, but in general, we can use the word uncomfortableness with life or with ourself, with being in that place. And just let's say we encounter an uncomfortableness. And uncomfortableness stems from the misunderstandings that are in the system, because the misunderstandings say, I am X, Y, and Z. Essentially, I am the doer and I need life to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And that's a belief about who we are that's out of line with what we really are. And then that self-identity, small s, self-identity, continually experiences life as an attack on what it is. And every time that life is experienced as an attack on what it is, this uncomfortableness with life, with oneself or with the other, is part of that resistance to life, is part of how we feel in the face of unfortunate situation or situation that we didn't expect or we didn't want. And so that's been happening historically throughout our life. And so that reaction then inherently has a lot of uncomfortableness in it. And the best that we've come up with is to distract ourselves and suppress that uncomfortableness. So that uncomfortableness we haven't been equipped to deal with it. We haven't been equipped to see that it's not based on an understanding of who we are. So the false understanding of who we are is in place, and so we feel this and we think, well, that's just how life is. And so the best we have is the ability to suppress it. The body finds a way of suppressing this uncomfortableness. And that means we've got a lifetime of guilt and blame that we're carrying around with us. And guilt and blame essentially is an uncomfortableness with oneself and with the other. And it's held in the body system. So part of the distraction that is part of the suppressing of these energies is to escape into ideas and stories about the past and the future, where in the story we make ourselves right, or we imagine things in the future that will create a positive sense of who we are. So we found this sort of better place than feeling the uncomfortableness in the stream of thinking. And we haven't necessarily realized that that stream of thinking is not the solution. It's a band-aid, if anything. And so when the pointers start pointing out that this being caught in the thinking mind and being disconnected from the body is part of the problem, and we have to come back into the body and become present with life and start seeing life as it is, rather than seeing it through a conceptual framework, we then, I'll start coming back here. But when we come back, what we encounter is all of the uncomfortableness that's been locked away in the body. And so then it can start to feel counterintuitive to come into the body. So we say, no, this isn't good. And we go back into the other place, back into our thinking. And ultimately, if we don't come into the body and start seeing what this uncomfortableness is, it just is going to perpetuate, it's going to remain there. And the deeply ingrained beliefs of personal doership and attachment to outcome are actually contained in this energetic load in the body. So they dissolve not only by the working mind getting a good intellectual understanding, but by us becoming familiar of the misunderstanding contained in the body. And as we see the misunderstanding that's contained in the body, then the intellectual understanding of the working mind gets to be applied to that misunderstanding. And that means that the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper. So what you've described is simply a description. When I come into the body, there is an uncomfortableness. What is that? And what to do, like how to approach it. And so the description I've given is that that uncomfortableness is the uncomfortableness of the past that happened when life unfolded and we interpreted it from a point of view of personal doership, both myself and the doer, with attachment to outcomes, where we believed that we needed life to be a particular way in order for it to be okay. And it was repressed. My description suggests that the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcomes are not only held in our conscious mind, but a large store, the root of this doership and attachment to outcome, is connected in the body and contained in these feelings. So if we can understand that these feelings can't actually hurt us, they can't kill us, although that's what it feels like when we rest in there, the feeling is that this is going to kill me. Because that's what the circumstance in the past was interpreted as by the self-identity. When life doesn't turn out the way we feel it needs to, essentially that is felt like an attack on who I am. And if that attack is big enough, it's sensed that it will kill me. Not necessarily physically kill me, but it is such an attack on my self-identity that if the attack is strong enough, it will kill me. So those feelings of uncomfortableness in the body, essentially, if we rest there, it's telling us, get out, this is going to kill you. But it won't, it can't. Those feelings can't kill you. They can't hurt you. They can't even touch you. So slowly, and I would suggest we do it slowly, you stay there just a little bit longer, knowing that it's very important to become aware of what's unseen, what's in the subconscious, what's contained in the body, because it will reveal the particulars of your belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. It will reveal certain hatreds towards yourself and towards the other because of certain outcomes that were not in line with your preferences. And then the concept of belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, which is a generic explanation, will be seen for yourself, for your own particular makeup. So it then starts to become not just a generic explanation, but you start to see the particular doership and attachment to outcome that's contained in your system. And that's when the real change starts to happen, because where you're now coming in contact with what is really there, what's in place. You're not just conceptually saying, oh, well, there are these beliefs in doership and attachment to outcome, but you're seeing them. Yeah? Because the event that happened in the past where someone let you down, at that point in time, there was a feeling, I hate you for what you've done. Right? That's the belief in personal doership, blame towards the other for what they have done that delivered pain to you. And so when that feeling is encountered, we really get to see the doership that is existent in our system. And I wouldn't suggest that you take this on as a practice where where some doer entity says, I have to feel these energies at all costs, because that would be more of the thinking mind trying to take a description as a prescription. So what I'm describing is that if the body-mind organism gets reconditioned a certain way, there may be more willingness, more capacity to be with these uncomfortable energies, knowing that it is useful to be with them. Right? So I'm not suggesting that we push ourselves beyond what naturally happens. So just the discussion that we're having here might have created a new reason for the body to, or for awareness, attention, to rest in the uncomfortable feeling of being in the body a little bit longer than it would without this explanation. And in doing that, who knows what follows? Who knows what insight comes or what's seen? But once again, the attitude of non-doership means that if we're watching and we drop into the body at a certain point in time, we see that's a happening. And if there's an uncomfortableness, and then we find ourselves moving away from that, distracting ourselves, and not being interested in looking in that direction, see that as a happening. Don't resist it and say, oh no, I have to not distract myself. Just notice the distracting happening. And then you can notice when the distracting happens, then I don't get to feel. Okay? So just a description, just an observation of what is without insisting that it be different. And then the next time that you drop into the uncomfortable feeling, you might just find you're witnessing this, you drop in and are witnessing this, and you feel the uncomfortableness, and then you might witness yourself staying there longer than before. So the process really is a process that happens. Well, ideally it's a process that happens. That's what I was talking about, where the seeking gets to a point where we're not interested in making it happen today. We know that we can't make it happen today. It might be a gradual process. And that's when the seeking continues to happen, but it's much more effortless. Because there isn't someone insisting on it being a certain way. And if you do manage to remain in the feeling long enough that it starts to reveal more about what it is, because at first it can seem like just undefined uncomfortableness. What's really beneficial if it starts to become much more defined, which might mean we start feeling some uncomfortableness in more detail from the past, which might mean then some thoughts of extreme blame or hatred towards someone. And if our working mind isn't equipped a certain way, we might draw the conclusion that, no, this isn't helpful, this is me being very unenlightened, blaming the other for what they've done. But actually what's happening is we're tapping into a blame that has happened in the past and needs to be atoned, needs to be seen in a different light. And in order for it to be seen in a different light, it needs to be seen in the light that it exists in, right? The blame itself needs to be seen. The seeing it in a different light happens simultaneous to the blame presenting itself in its full force. Right? So what I'm suggesting here is if the uncomfortableness starts to change from being a undefined uncomfortableness to now being the remembering of a specific event that has a very defined uncomfortableness in it, that's very useful. And not to think that that coming up is in opposition to your enlightenment. It's not in opposition to the end of blame. It's actually supportive of the process of the end of blame. So this is where it's a bit tricky, because we think, well, here I am sort of, we might think that we're reinforcing the story or believing the story by allowing it to come up. But what you're doing is you're allowing it to present itself in the way it was locked away in the past, a way that we've suppressed. So allow it to come up, and so finding a private space you can go into where you don't have to worry about other people and what they might think about this expression, and put words onto it. Allow it to develop however it develops. So the emotion might become very intense and you might start shouting, you might start crying. Just witness all of that as the movement of an energy that has been suppressed in the body, and essentially is what continues to force you to see the other in this moment through the eyes of doership and attachment to outcome. And as more and more of this starts to come out of the system, less and less doership and attachment remains in the system. And then automatically we find that our relationship to the other starts to change in a surprising way. We find someone delivers pain and our reaction is surprisingly different. We might have a biological reaction to the pain, but we find that the suffering doesn't get extended in time. The story gets dropped. The only reason it's got dropped is not because we are now doing the dropping, but because the ingrained doership and attachment to outcome that was in the body, that was forcing the previous resistance to happen, has started to leave the body. And so now we're seeing things without any effort, more naturally, you could say, or more in line with the way they actually are. We automatically see the other as an instrument that is part of life, delivering pleasure or pain as is destined. We might biologically react one way or another. We will biologically react one way or another. And then, horizontally in time, the resistance, which is the load of suffering on top of the biological reaction, doesn't happen.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's interesting that you mentioned a while ago that an individual in whose case the beliefs in doership and outcomes have dissolved has probably a certain energy emanation or a frequency emanation. I mean, the words, or if I could simply put it as presence. So could you shed more light on this topic, in the sense that sometimes is it also true that just being in the presence of such an individual can start triggering processes within you which you may not necessarily bring about?
Yes, but I wouldn't want this topic to be misinterpreted as if someone has something that you don't have and that they can give you something you don't have, which is often how this topic of transmission is related to. So essentially, the way I would address the topic is that a human being is an energetic, well, you could say, let's look at it first as a biological organism, very complex biological organism. But clearly that biological organism includes very powerful energetic components to it. The thinking process in the brain is electromagnetics form of, there's just energy throughout the whole system. Everything in life has an energetic component to it. And so the body is producing heat all the time, and many different other forms of energy. So our whole system is an energetic unit. And depending on our makeup, that energetic formation or structure will be different. And so the notion that I put forward is that certain beliefs have a fairly dense energetic frequency, and therefore we get to experience life, and it will include that denseness if those beliefs are in place. So what we might feel is that if we're next to someone with very heavy belief systems, we might actually feel heavy, just because the body is an energetic system, and so the energy emanates outwards. And with energy, I'm not a physicist, but in a sense, the energy will continue to emanate out indefinitely, but it will get less and less strong as it gets further and further away from its source. But in theory, it will continue to extend out into infinity, but getting smaller and smaller in a sense, but never ending. So the notion is that the energy emanating from all of us is one big intertwined energetic system. And so very simply, I guess, that if the beliefs aren't there and there is a connection to a form of consciousness or an expression of consciousness that is less dense and what we could call the core of who we are, so not a belief of who we are, not a thought of who we are, but maybe that consciousness that just is. That has an energetic blueprint, frequency, and so it makes sense that we might then be able to feel that. And so the analogy would be like two tuning forks. And one tuning fork has the capacity to bring the other tuning fork into the same frequency as it vibrates at. And so what we often find is if we are in that space, the concepts that are put forward make so much sense. It's like, oh yeah, wow, I get it. Because we are now, in a way, we're resonating or vibrating at that lighter frequency where things just are seen that way. And then if we move out into the world and the frequency changes again, then the concepts, we have this sense, well, I've made so much sense. Then, but now I can't put it doesn't feel as clear. The insight, in a sense, isn't there. And so this can sound like we don't have what the other person has, but really what it is we have a little bit extra in terms of extra beliefs that have an extra density to them. And the process is really about those beliefs diminishing and revealing the core that we all have. So the lighter frequency I'm speaking about is the core of the human being. So everyone actually has it. It's that there's just this other addition that prevents it from being felt. So it makes sense that our process can be aided by being in certain places, and there are places on the planet that seem to have this vibration, not just people. It can be aided by being in the presence of a person, but in my opinion, it's the aid is where we the purpose is not just to sit in that being. That's part of it. So it's very important in this process to drop into being regularly, but also to start contemplating, because the contemplating starts undoing, being part of the process of undoing the core of the thinking mind. And as that happens, when we then move away, some of the load has been reduced, which means we can move away and have more of our own clarity. So really it's always about revealing the wisdom within ourselves, which we all have. And if someone becomes too attached to the feeling and thinking it's about the other person, then it becomes an attachment, an expectation. So I'm sort of a bit reluctant sometimes to speak about this. I know that I experienced it when I was with Ramesh, but it also became very clear to me that as the contemplating and the process happens within our own system, we have our own guidance system. That's what the Satguru is, where really the external information really just becomes the basis of our own contemplation and our own realizations. And then we find that this energy that seemed to belong to one person is what we all have inside of ourselves.
Raja, it's so amazing how you in your talks you impersonate that neutrality that you point to or guide to. It's like it's not separate from the teaching at all. It's all ingrained. How you say what you are pointing to is exactly what it is in the saying itself. I was just too amazed by this. Thank you very much. I did have a question which I was carrying from the first session. I didn't ask. It may not be very relevant here, but I'll still speak it out. If you feel you might want to discuss it next time, it's also all right. You often mention dropping to the heart. And this is something which puzzles me often. And I am wondering if it's also just a description. Kind of, in my experience, when it happens, it happens. When it does not happen, it does not happen. There's nothing I can do to drop into my heart, because when I try to drop in my heart, that's exactly when I'm not dropping into my heart. So if you can say a few more words about it, it might clarify something.
Yeah, so all of the deeply, deeply ingrained understanding, well, it's not even deeply, deeply ingrained. The absence of the opposite understanding is that no one ever does anything as a doer, but rather life is always functioning. So in each moment, it's simply the genes and up-to-date conditioning of a human being functioning, and there's no separate doer other than the body-mind organism functioning. And so there never is, whatever is said is never a prescription to a doer to do anything. Even if it can sound on the surface like it is, usually it sounds like an instruction or a prescription, because we're so used to knowing ourselves or thinking of ourselves as the doer. So whenever we get told about something or something described, we interpret it as an instruction. But it isn't an instruction, it's a description, like you said. So everything that is said is a description of what may happen, and not a prescription for someone or for something to do. Or not a prescription for something for someone to do. So dropping into the heart, so even if I say drop into the heart, it can sound like a prescription. It can sound like I'm telling someone to do dropping into the heart. But actually it's a description of what might happen as you're walking down the street. That dropping into the heart might happen. So usually I would say if you drop into the heart, which really means if dropping into the heart happens, the thinking mind gets cut off. So once again, the doer will hear this and think, oh, the thinking mind will get cut off if dropping into the heart happens. Therefore, what he's telling me to do is to drop into the heart in order for the thinking to stop. So that would be the doer's interpretation, because it's attached to an outcome. It's attached to the thinking mind stopping. So it says, okay, so I have to do dropping into the heart. But if anyone who's listening to the talks, if they can keep in mind that the talks are always descriptions of what might happen and not a prescription of something that someone has to do. So let's talk about dropping into the heart, because it is something that can happen, and it can happen as a result of the body-mind organism becoming reconditioned with information that leads to a dropping into the heart, which, if it happens, is not someone's doing, but simply the functioning of the body-mind organism that has been equipped with some new information. Not only new information, but basically the new information has changed the body-mind organism. So in my process at some point when I was reading I Am That and the teachings of Nisargadatta, after months and years, it becomes very clear that his teaching is essentially telling us, you are not the body, you are consciousness. Right? Not that that's the truth, but it's a important bit of information that can aid in a movement, in a change in the way we relate to life. So his teaching is saying, you're not the body, you are consciousness, you are formless awareness. That which is aware of the body, that which is aware of the whole universe. What he means by universe is the universe as it's presenting in front of you right now. So this, essentially, is the universe. And if we think that we are awareness, aware of the whole universe as something very big, we'll have this expectation that one day I'll bump into or shift into being some godlike awareness that is aware of the whole universe, light years of galaxies and planets, and we might be waiting to have the awareness of the universe as a universe, some conceptual universe that is out there. But as I came to relate to the teaching, you are not the body, you are awareness, you are consciousness, in which the universe or the world arises. And he's talking about the world as it presents in the present moment. So within the field of awareness. And the other part of his teaching is, and I'm simplifying it, but relevant to this topic, abide in I am. That was what Nisargadatta's guru instructed, or not necessarily instructed as a prescription, but as new conditioning, told him, abide in I am, that's all that is required. And so Nisargadatta said that I trusted my guru, and so I found that abiding in I am happened, and after 3 years of this movement of returning to I am, returning to the heart, self-realization happened. So, abide in I am is a very powerful part of his teaching. And the question is, what does it mean? And for me, what it came to mean is that there's the thinking mind, and the thinking mind is not who I am. The thinking mind is a self-identity. So if you abide in the thinking mind, you're not in touch with the core of your being. And then there is a pointing to what you truly are is to be found in the heart, let's say, not the physical heart, but what's referred to as the spiritual heart, in the body, or it's not actually in the physical body, but it's not necessarily to be found out there, but rather by dropping into the spiritual heart and knowing yourself prior to any thought. Knowing what you are that doesn't require you to think it into existence. So what I found started happening automatically was that thanks to the pointers that I'm putting forward that are talking about suffering in practical terms, there was a clear understanding that guilt and blame and pride, worry, anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcomes are all of the different forms of the thinking mind, and all of the different forms of the small self, all of the different forms of remaining outside of a connection to what we are. So that became clear intellectually. And then I also started experiencing the dropping out of that thinking, where life is able to be observed or witnessed without a stream of thought, and a sense of who I am as awareness or beingness or consciousness presents. It's like a different gear where we can rest, feel our existence, witness life, but without needing to think about our own existence, without needing to label everything. And so this understanding, intellectual understanding, and experiential shift into this place of being meant that an effortless practice started to happen. And that effortless practice was that whenever the working mind and awareness recognized that the thinking mind was at play, the thought I am arose, and the thought I am was included in it essentially all of my understanding about how suffering is not based on an understanding of life and who I am, that it's not actually going to get me where we really want to be, which is a connection to oneself. And so as the thought I am arose, it effectively cut off the thinking of the thinking mind and reminded me to drop into the heart and just be. And at first, what I'd find is that I'd drop into that place of being, and before I knew it, would get dragged back out into the thinking mind. And that's okay, that's just how the process works, because the thinking mind can be very, can have quite a momentum to it. And I'd get, let's say, dragged out back into the thinking without even realizing that that had happened. And maybe 15 minutes later, awareness of that thinking, having started up again, happens, and the thought I am just arises, cuts off the thinking, and we get to drop into this other place of being where we realize, oh, I am. What it means is when we know that there is this place of being where I don't need to think it into existence, I already am. It essentially means that all this thinking about what I need in the future is all misunderstanding. It's the misunderstanding that has forgotten, no, you already are. So, once again, when the awareness becomes aware of the thinking mind, the thought I am arises and says, that's not necessary. You exist now. Rest there. And so we don't make the dropping into I am happen because we don't make the awareness of the thinking mind happen. We don't make the thinking mind happen either. So what the whole process is a process where the thinking mind starts, or it's already going, and then the working mind and awareness recognizes that the thinking mind has been happening, which in itself is a happening. The recognition is a happening, and then the thought I am, which contains in it all of the understanding that that thinking really doesn't serve a purpose. That arises as a happening, and the dropping into I am or being happens, not something that you do. The whole thing is a sequential happening based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So listening to this explanation is not a prescription of something for you to do, but it's new conditioning that becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning. And then the body starts functioning automatically. So you don't need to go out and make this happen. It happens if the conditioning becomes aware of the thinking mind, that very same conditioning of the working mind might throw up the thought, I am, and then a dropping into being might happen. All automatic. Now the thought, I am, could be replaced by any other word or thought you like. It could be stop. And drop into being. Now, once again, it sounds like I'm saying you have to drop into being, but it's this automatic sequential movement. A recognizing of the thinking mind, the thoughts stop. Stop contains in it, stop, this is not helpful, this is not useful, this is actually the obstacle to where you need to be. But we don't need to keep saying that. Actually, it's much more effective if it's just a sharp thought that just arises. That thought becomes like a bookend for the thinking mind. And then we have the capacity, or not the capacity, a movement happens of dropping into being. And over weeks, so this might happen once a day, it might happen 20 times a day. Why not? If the thinking mind kicks up 20 times and it's recognized, we might find this stop arising 20 times in a day or 100 times in a day. At first we might find ourselves resting in being for a second or two, or half a second. But in time, the capacity to rest in being increases. It becomes more known as our home. And that means less of the thinking mind. What it also means is we get first-hand experiential knowledge of this part of the human being, that the part of ourself as a person, as a human being, that we were completely disconnected from. A part of ourself that isn't interested in changing life, but more interested in being part of life, witnessing life.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Can I ask one more question? This is probably, again, to understand a little more about this itself. It's about that place where we start to feel intense joy sometimes. Is that in any way connected to this? Or, I mean, can you just say anything about that? I don't know how to ask the right question about it.
Intense joy is, I guess you could say, an aspect of ourself, but it's not the aspect of ourself that can be there on a continuous, unbroken basis. The aspect of ourself that can be there on a continuous, unbroken basis, to me, is the peace. Because an example of this is if your mother is dying, let's say. Does it make sense that you're going to be experiencing intense joy? And to me, the answer is no. Certain circumstances don't support certain feelings, certain expressions. And yet, on the other hand, the basic nature of ourself, that which I'm describing as peace with circumstance, is something that can happen when your mother is dying. There can be a biological sadness happening, but there can be this background of equanimity and knowing that this is not in any way an attack on who I am. That the fact that a parent is dying is not part of who I am being taken away. And so from that point, the biological sadness, the biological pain of seeing them in pain, for example, can be there, and yet there is an equanimity and a peace. Whereas to understand that there is the biological pain and sadness of seeing that event, and simultaneously joy, to me doesn't make so much sense. And so often when people talk about bliss and joy and love, if I point out certain things to them, they'll agree actually peace is a better word for what they are talking about. And this is one of the problems, in a way, that if we use words like joy and love and bliss to describe peace, then that can create the opposite of clarity. It can create confusion, because we're waiting for this bliss or joy to arise. And I don't believe that's something that's available on a continuous, unbroken basis, whereas peace, to me, makes complete sense, that you can be at peace by being grounded in yourself and still find yourself in unfortunate circumstance. Having said that, out of the peace and the connection with oneself, from time to time, if circumstance is supportive, we find these more complex expressions of self, like bliss and love and joy and awe. But those they rise and fall, and so we can enjoy them and appreciate them when they're there, but not relate to them as though they need to be or can be the lowest common denominator, unbroken experience.
Yeah, and to the same effect, I see that in me the thought of that them being a distraction rises quite a few times, which I also wanted to clarify. It's a neutral standpoint that works best, I believe, there also. But it's difficult to have neutral standpoint when you have intense.
When you have intense joy or intense suffering?
Intense joy or intense.
Yeah. So these gushes that come in often are related somewhat to the phenomena of contrast. When our life starts changing such that the suffering, which has become like a background and we're so used to it, when that starts falling away and the absence of that is there, which is sort of like having a headache and then the headache stopping. The contrast between the two states can make it seem like the experience of it can be as if something positive is added in. So when the headache stops, we go, this is bliss. But it's only bliss relative to the uncomfortableness or the pain of the headache. And so if suffering was there, and suffering is a strong uncomfortableness, and then it stops, okay, and actually mistake peace for bliss because of the contrast effect. Whereas if the headache stops, what's really there is normal health, let's say. And when normal health is there consistently, you no longer have the contrast, and so you don't experience it as blissful. You don't say, that's bliss. And in the same way, when the peace becomes more consistent, it becomes known as actually just peace, not something relative to the absence of peace. And on top of that, when this shifting is happening, and maybe we're not completely familiar with this as our true nature, as what we are, a lot of thoughts of appreciation and gratitude can come in. And that the thought of the gratitude to God for bringing these shifts in, can be experienced as joy and awe. And so if we look at it closely, we see, actually, the joy is not just the lowest common denominator of our true essence, but that appreciating the life we're in and the thought, there's a thought in the appreciation. Thank you, what more could I ask for? And that can then turn into a feeling of joy and appreciation, gratitude. And so they're all beautiful things. I'm not trying to dismiss them or reduce it down or say they're not significant. I'm just trying to create descriptions that allow us to appreciate them for what they are, essentially. And so that which is available according to this teaching on a continuous, unbroken basis, regardless of the circumstance, is a very simple internal equanimity and peace that equates to the absence of the thinking mind, the absence of suffering, and a connection to the core of our being, which means we know our connection to Source. And that connection to Source provides a very subtle but powerful sense of peace and contentment.